All right, so this is video lesson number 34. Today we're going to be talking about plate boundary interactions and geologic formations as a result of those interactions. So we're going to do the format a little bit different for this today. What I'd like to do first is jump back here and say, why am I watching this video lesson? So what is it that you're trying to do here with this video lesson? The first thing is you're trying to learn the three plate boundary interactions. You want to be able to look down, immediately look at the arrows that show direction of plate movement and tell me the names of those. The second thing is you want to understand that direction of that plate movement has a lot to do with what type of geological formation it makes. And the third thing is you have to learn the names of those geologic formations as a result of those plate tectonics moving around. Okay, so what we're going to do first is I want to point out that this goes along with page 147 and page 148 of your interactive notebook. So if you have this stuff handy, that's probably going to be really a good resource that you can look back onto. And so the first thing that we're going to do is I just want to talk about the names of the plate boundaries. There's convergent, and then there's divergent, and then there's transform. Okay, you need to have that language in your vocabulary. You need to look at those plates and understand that convergent plate boundaries are when plates move towards each other, and divergent plate boundaries are when they move away from each other, and transform boundaries are when they move side by side. All right, and so just to kind of showcase that quickly, I'll zoom back out here just for a second. Whoops, wrong way. So if you take, for instance, convergent plates, mean they're moving towards each other. There's three ways that this can happen. There's oceanic versus oceanic plates. There's continental versus oceanic plates. And then there's continental versus continental. So each one of those convergent plate actions, which means those two plates are moving towards each other, is going to result in a different type of geologic formation. So for instance, if you look on page 147, the three that we glued in that were all part of the same piece, they were from convergent plate boundaries. So you have your continent to continent collisions. Okay, that's when two continents glide into each other. All right, when those two things make contact, that rigid part of the crust gets pushed upwards. Therefore, it creates continental mountains. You can have continent to ocean collisions. So your continental plate is colliding with your oceanic plate. One thing to keep in mind about this is your oceanic plate has a higher density than the continental plate. Therefore, when they collide, your oceanic plate is going to be the one that sinks underneath your continental plate. Once that sinking action starts to happen, it remelts some of that crust, which causes it change in density, which ultimately that crust will rise as a liquid form and create a couple of things. The one thing you can have is continental volcanoes. The other thing you might have is a trench where the initial oceanic plate starts to dive underneath your continental plate. And the last thing that you might end up with is some earthquake action. Okay, so I'm going to zoom back out here so you can take a look at that again. And the very last thing you might have is oceanic to oceanic. When two oceanic plates collide, they're both heavy, they both have high densities, and therefore you should traditionally get a deep oceanic trench. Ultimately, you still end up with some subduction that takes place, and subduction just means that one plate is going underneath another plate, and that can result in deep oceanic trenches and potentially underwater volcanic mountains. Okay, so that is just the convergent plate interaction. So I'm going to zoom back out again real quick and show you that. Convergent plates go towards each other, and there's three ways that they can happen: oceanic versus oceanic, oceanic versus continental, and continental versus continental. All right. Next type of plate interaction that you might see is divergent. All right, well, divergent means to split apart or go away from each other. So we're going to represent that with two arrows that are going opposite directions. Geologic formation that could result are mid-ocean ridges and rift valleys. So we're going to look back here at page 148, and we're going to zoom in to the image that shows divergent plate boundaries separate. So what you ultimately have is some hot magma underneath the ocean, and that hot magma wants to rise because of its lower in density, and then it causes that buildup along the mid-ocean ridge as these two plates slowly separate. This is what's found in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and that's what causes that seafloor spreading in the middle of the Atlantic. All right, our last category of plate interaction boundary is going to be transform interaction boundaries. It's where plates slide next to each other. So you have two plates that are next to each other. Instead of subducting or making mountains because they're pushing towards each other, what you end up with is just one going one direction and the other plate moving the opposite direction. Geologic formations that could happen as a result of that are fracture zones and earthquakes. And so we'll take a look here at our image that we glued in to page 148. And this is a great image that shows this block of crust moving this way, and we have this block of crust moving the opposite direction. And this is a classic example of what happens in the San Andreas Fault in California, and that's going to result in earthquakes and fracture zones. Okay, so that's what you want to look at just to get a quick review of plate boundaries and interactions and geologic formations as a result. So what I'd like to do is just quickly hit the lesson review and see if we could fill this out. So what are the three types of plate boundary interactions? I'm just going to write these out as we go along. So you have convergent, and then divergent, and transform. So let's talk about the next question is, what directions do those plates move with each boundary type? Well, convergent means they are moving towards each other. All right. Divergent moves they are moving away from each other. And transform means they are moving next to each other. All right, so the things that you need to keep in mind are there are three types of convergent boundaries. There's oceanic versus oceanic versus continental, and of course continental versus continental. For divergent zones, you have mid-ocean ridges and rift valleys, and then transform faults. You have your fault zones, which can lead to earthquakes. All right, so if you would go back online and take activity quiz number 25. This activity quiz is located on the website, and you will be able to check your knowledge of this particular lesson.